Welcome to Stephen Foster at 200. I'm your co-host, Jason Lee Guthrie. On today's episode, I talk with Bill Brooks about the connection between Stephen Foster and Gussie Davis. Bill is an Emeritus Professor at the University of Illinois and at the University of York. He is also Senior Research Fellow and Series Editor at the Orpheus Research Centre in Ghent, Belgium. Bill has published widely in American Musicology and has had a successful composition career. He draws from his experience in both the academic and performance worlds during our conversation. You have researched one of Stephen Foster's most famous songs, The Old Folks at Home, more commonly known today as Swanee River. So I wanted to start by asking you to give just some general contemporary context about that song. For a listener that may be aware of it today through some sort of modern pop culture means, tell us a little bit more about its own context during its own time.
A contemporary explanation of Swanee River is that it's the state song of Florida, and that for over 50 years, there was considerable controversy about its lyrics, which have been completely rewritten to accommodate modern sensibilities. That's because the song originated as a minstrel song in the 1850s. And while the lyrics are not demeaning, especially, they are grounded in slavery. The expression of the words is heavily racialized. That is to say, dialect is pervasive in the lyrics. And the general depiction of Black people, this is antebellum period, this is the 1850s, the general depiction of Black people as not only contented with their position of servitude, but actually longing to return to it, was a crucial part of the nation's struggle as it moved toward the Civil War. There's a long and more complicated prehistory that has to do with reaching beyond Stephen Foster to other minstrel paradigms, Jim Crow, Zip Coon, and that contributed in a very direct way to the cultural debate, not necessarily political debate, but the cultural debate that brought the nation eventually into civil war.
So it's fair to say that the listener that has primarily interacted with the song through, say, Bugs Bunny with the Swanee River refrain is missing a lot of that underlying context.
It's interesting that you mentioned Bugs Bunny. In a sense, you're missing it. In a sense, you're just getting a reduced, packaged version of the same thing. There's plenty of scholarship that argues that cartoons, the early Looney Tunes, and definitely Mickey Mouse, are basically latter-day forms of minstrelsy. So tradition is still with us.
Absolutely.
We mustn't ever assume that it is not. I think the best musical film that anybody's made in recent decades is Bamboozled by Spike Lee, which depicts a minstrel show more perfectly, more accurately than any other film that I've seen. And it's simultaneously horrifying and hilarious. And it puts the viewer in an absolutely unmanageable predicament. It's a wonderful movie.
You connect Foster's career with that of Gussie Davis's after Reconstruction in the 1880s. I'm interested to know a little bit more about Foster's influence on the music industry that Davis was working in at that time.
There isn't really much of an influence, except that publishers fought amongst each other for titles and copyrights to Foster tunes. The copyright laws were very different at that time. We're talking now about the 1880s and 1890s. Copyright laws were very different. A Foster melody was public domain at that point. So if you issued it without alteration, you didn't really have any protection. Publishers' solutions sometimes were to publish a variation on the song, publish a version that had altered words or one kind or another. That way you could claim copyright, and arguably you could sue somebody who published your version. That didn't happen as often as people think. The courts were not interested, particularly in manufacturing copyright. Walt Disney had not been born. So Foster's influence on the publishing industry in the 1880s and 1890s was that he was a property to be exploited. That's basically all there is to it.
Which is really interesting when we think about some of the predominant representations in the industry. And even today, when we think about the relationship between songwriters and artists and the industry, this exploitive aspect of it has always been there. For Gussie Davis, what were opportunities afforded to aspiring performers in the music industry of the late 19th century? Who were they allowed to be? And then maybe if they did, how did they kind of push back and expand those opportunities once they got their foot in the door?
First of all, there's a big difference between a white performer and a black performer. Secondly, a lot of black performers were very white in physical appearance. The black performers tended to be dominated. I say tended because, for example, Billy Kersands, who was arguably the most successful minstrel performer of the 19th century, continuing into the 20th, was very dark and made a thing out of that. That was part of his shtick. Most black performers had tricks or novelties that distinguished them from each other and to some extent from the white performers. So Billy Kersands, again, had an enormous mouth, and part of his routine was to stuff it with billiard balls. This was considered hilarious, and probably was. The guy was a comic genius. But it seems demeaning and weird in the present day, and it's not something that any white performer, to my knowledge, ever did. In any case, the mechanisms available to both performers were the stage, basically. There was no recording at the time. Technology had not come into existence. We're talking 1865 forward. Recordings came in the 1890s, or 1893 or thereabouts. So up until that point, the only way to make a living as a performer was to go on the stage. And the stage basically consisted of legitimate theater, which encompassed everything from slapstick comedy to Shakespeare, down to the most basic minstrel show, which was 6 or 8 performers sitting in a circle on the stage and doing their thing. White performers did minstrel shows in blackface. Black performers also did minstrel shows in blackface, partly in some cases because they looked white, and partly in some cases because it was just the tradition to black up. After the Civil War in 1865, black performers, led by Charles Hicks, formed the Georgia Minstrels. It was the first black minstrel company. White minstrel companies dated from the 1840s at least, arguably even earlier, depending upon how you trace the history. But black companies didn't form until 1865. The Georgia Minstrels continued for a long time, with most of their career being in Australia, but that's another complicated story. The Georgia Minstrels set the tone. Because they are black performers, they claim to be a truer portrayal of plantation life, of everything that the minstrel songs purported to be about. The old home on the Swanee River. If you were a black person, theoretically, you knew all about that from personal experience. Of course, they didn't really. Most of the black performers had never been slaves. Most, not all of them. So the Black Minstrel Show evolved as a kind of shadow, or almost a satire. If you were a black person in the audience, you recognized things in that show that were hilarious because they're taking the piss out of white performers to some extent. Very complicated situation. At the same time, the black performers eventually began to move into more mainstream minstrel circuits and eventually became part of integrated shows. By the 1900s, black performers were creating their own shows, which were full-blown musical comedies and starring in them, and then moved into mainstream theater and music during the war years and on into the 1920s when they came to dominate the music scene.
It all sounds really complicated and nuanced and difficult for historians and musicologists to decipher. Something I really appreciated in your work is a part of the way that you're trying to approach that complexity is by centering the experiences of African Americans as audiences for early American popular music. Can you talk a little bit more about that choice? I would even be interested to hear a little bit about the methodology challenges of actually sourcing that. But just in general, why center African American audiences?
First of all, there was noticeably in the 1880s and 90s a strong black middle class, which in a lot of respects was not very different from the white middle class. Black middle class households had pianos. Black middle class households sat around those pianos and sang popular songs. The popular songs that they sang were by white composers and by black composers. So the repertoire and the context for the repertoire is not radically different in the races. The meaning of the repertoire often was very different. And in particular, black composers tended to play on ambivalence or hidden meanings or sly satire, sometimes of the stereotypes, the very stereotypes that the white performers were generating. The most egregious example of this, and in a way the most successful example among black composers of popular music, was the creation of the coon song, which was largely invented by black musicians and by Ernst Hogan in particular. The coon song was egregiously exploitative and egregiously racist. And it's very hard for me to believe that black audiences were embracing that racism. This is at the height of Jim Crow. I can't conceive of the circumstances. I can conceive that black audiences thought that white performers doing this music were ridiculous and enjoyed black performers making fun of the white performing tradition. So, as always, in racial relations, but it's in particular in post-Reconstruction America, you have to read everybody's responses through the lens of the racial dynamic at the time. And the racial dynamic, I hasten to say, was not always adversarial at all. There were many ways in which blacks in Cincinnati in the 1880s found their natural allies among the Irish in the 1880s in Cincinnati. They both worked on the waterfront. They both were heckled and jeered by upper-class whites. And the two groups were in direct competition, which is why you have the riots and the racial bigotry that is depicted in Cincinnati's history. I'm picking Cincinnati because that's where Gussie Davis was born and raised.
But these things played out all over.
These played out all over. But Cincinnati was a particular hot spot. The same thing was true in Cleveland. The same thing was true throughout the Midwest, basically. The East Coast is a different situation. The Midwest, these cities were still developing.
Anything else you'd like to add about the world that Gussie Davis inhabited, or how it can help us to better understand Stephen Foster or even American music today?
I'll just say that I've been working on Gussie Davis and on African American musicians of that period for quite a while, and I have confronted over and over again the thought, should I, as a white male, an old white male, moreover, I, as a white male, be studying this stuff? I started my career with Charles Ives, who was a white male, very much like me. I was raised in Connecticut. He lived in Connecticut. I knew all the tunes and so forth. So why am I not still studying Charles Ives? The fact is that up until about World War I, then things change. Black culture and white culture in America were so far removed from present-day culture that it doesn't matter. You might as well be an ethnographer going to Africa. It's a completely different world. And the only way to come to any understanding of that passes beyond stereotypical history. The good guys were the white guys and the good guys were the North because they fought the South and they freed the slaves and Lincoln was a great man and everything is just like we learned in our second grade history books. The only way to get past all of that is to dig into the data and to look very carefully at individual cases, at individual songs, at individual performers, try to comprehend what they were doing and what the situation was. Gussie Davis, I find, as a particularly fine example of this, and that's why I become fascinated with his life and career.
Stephen Foster at 200 is a companion podcast to the edited volume Stephen Foster at 200, A Critical Reappraisal. If you enjoyed this episode, check out the book for in-depth, peer-reviewed research authored by our guests. You can also check out our website, stephenfosterat200.com, for more information about the book and links to more research from our guests. This podcast is hosted by Jenny Lightwise Goff and me, Jason Lee Guthrie. I am also the executive producer. Our intro theme is by Joel Corey. O Oksana, the Russian language cover of O Susanna you're hearing now, is by Dan Vexler. Logo design by Alan Z. Support for this podcast comes from a generous grant from the Music and Entertainment Industry Educators Association. The best way for you to support the show is by leaving a review wherever you listen to podcasts and sharing the show on social media.